Rest.
And I'll ask everyone to mute if you aren't already muted. All right, so welcome everyone to the Water Affordability Advocacy Toolkit, Affordability and Assistance Programs webinar, hosted by River Network. I'm Bernita Haynes, a staff attorney at National Consumer Law Center, and I will be your moderator for today. All right, so we'll jump right on into this. Today's webinar is based on the Water Affordability Advocacy Toolkit that was published by NRDC and NCLC back in June of last year. The Water Affordability Advocacy Toolkit reflects input from lots of amazing advocates from all around the country, some of whom are our speakers on today's webinar. There were many contributing reviewers as well beyond the NRDC and NCLC authors. A quick overview of what you'll find in the Water Affordability Advocacy Toolkit. The Water Advocacy Toolkit discusses how to protect people from losing access to water, including a discussion about water shutoffs, water liens, water debt, billing problems and dispute resolution, protections for and support for renters. The toolkit also looks at how to make essential water services affordable for low-income households, with a discussion of equitable water rates, water efficiency and plumbing repair assistance, affordability and assistance programs, on which today's webinar is based, and protections and support for renters. The toolkit also looks at how to enable more effective advocacy, specifically going over some discussion of data collection and transparency, accountability, and participation in decision-making. So generally what you'll find in a toolkit are some in-depth explanations and explorations of the aforementioned topics, questions that can help advocates assess gaps in state and local laws and policies, some examples of strong state and local programs, policies, some strong consumer protections from around the country, as well as a discussion of some of the pitfalls to look out for in advocating for water affordability and other policy ideas to consider. I want to draw your attention very quickly here to something that is discussed at length in this particular module in the Water Affordability Toolkit, this distinction between affordability and assistance programs. So the terms affordability program and assistance programs are often used pretty interchangeably, but for many water advocates, they mean very different things, as discussed in depth in the toolkit. I want to emphasize that difference right here and explain that affordability programs are more so about limiting household bills to a predetermined percentage of the household income, whereas assistance programs provide a very set amount of assistance regardless of the resulting bill size. I want you to keep that in mind as you listen to today's discussions. Right. What are some things you'll find specifically in the Affordability and Assistance Programs module of the toolkit? Well, you'll find a discussion about distinguishing between affordability and assistance programs, as mentioned, using percentage of income payment plans, PIPs in other words, and traditional water assistance programs to help households dealing with water bill issues, incorporating some best practices to improve participation rates and making water bills more affordable, and so forth, using state and federal strategies to overcome certain barriers to program implementation, and then funding affordability and assistance programs at the local, state, and federal levels. During today's presentation, you'll learn about Pennsylvania and California, specifically including solutions that will be spotlighted at the local and state levels, policy approaches including income-based rates, debt relief, crisis assistance, and more, some advocacy strategies including legislation, litigation, and collaboration, some practical advice applicable in both rural and urban communities, differences in approaches for public versus private water utilities, applying EPA's new Clean Water Act financial capability assessment guidance to drive some local progress on affordability, and then additional River Network tools to support your work and other advocacy work in achieving clean, safe, and affordable water outcomes. Today, Rob Ballinger will be talking specifically about Philly's PIP and how it got adopted. Liz Marks will be talking about the successful efforts in Pittsburgh and other parts of Pennsylvania, both public-owned systems and IOUs. Kyle Jones will be speaking about state-level efforts in California, while Larry Levine will address the EPA guidance mentioned before. And April Engel and Colleen Walters will cover the River Network's resources.
Yeah, Ricky.
Please do mute yourself so that there's no background noise. Before I get ready to turn it over to our speakers today, I would like to remind you that there will be a Q&A at the end of this webinar, so please do add any questions you have to the chat. I will be keeping an eye on it. But also please visit the link here or the QR code to the full toolkit. And if you have any questions, thoughts, feel free to contact Larry or my colleague Olivia Wine about the toolkit. Without further ado, I am going to turn it over to our speakers.
I think I'm up first. So hi, everyone. Liz Marks with the Pennsylvania Utility Law Project. Let me just give me a moment while I share my screen. I hope that's up and everyone can see it. So first off, who we are is a statewide legal services program within the Pennsylvania Legal Aid Network. We're a pretty small team of 8, and our mission is to secure just and equitable access to safe and affordable utility services for Pennsylvanians experiencing poverty. We work to achieve this mission really by empowering individuals and groups, community-based groups, through legal representation, education, support services, and consultation. So this is really squarely up our alley. We've been working on affordability issues for about the last 40 years in Pennsylvania. So just real high level, because I want to dig into some of the details of the programs we've been able to establish in Pennsylvania through collaboration and through litigation. But first, I think it's important to start with a bit of a picture on water affordability in Pennsylvania. And it probably looks a lot like what water affordability challenges look like in your states as well. We right now have increasing water rates. At this point, we're seeing regularly Pennsylvanians, low-income families facing water and wastewater burdens exceeding 10% of their income. In 2022, we had roughly 30,000 households just across the 3 largest private water utilities in Pennsylvania lose their water and wastewater services to their home. Just want to briefly further contextualize those 30,000 terminations last year to say that in the same time frame, Pennsylvania distributed our $46 million in crisis funding through the Low-Income Water Assistance Program to over 40,000 households. You can just imagine what that 30,000 number would look like if we had not had that emergency relief through LIWAP. And I'll note a bit later that some of the success in Pennsylvania with LIWAP is really because of the collaborative approach we've had for many years with our utilities and our both municipal and IOUs to advance water affordability and other policies affecting access. So of course, the drivers, many of them are the same that you're seeing, right? These really important issues of removing lead from the systems, removing forever chemicals, and making sure our stormwater systems are able to handle the higher incidence of flooding, the larger storms we're getting. At the same time, Pennsylvania also has a factor that many of you may not be seeing, and that's privatization. And in 2016, Pennsylvania changed the valuation of acquired water and wastewater utilities, which allowed private water to rate base the fair market value of an acquired system rather than the depreciated value. So far in Pennsylvania, there have been about 19 approved acquisitions, though there are dozens more pending approval, none of which, I'll note, were troubled or non-viable systems. Across those 19 acquisitions, we saw a combined rate base of over 856 million because of that change in valuation. And that resulted in about 1.86 times the depreciated costs that those acquired systems assets gave to the system. So that was a lot of wonky speak. So what I'll say is the Pennsylvania Office of Consumer Advocate estimates that consumers are paying about $68 million each year more through their water and wastewater bill, not because we're improving the systems, but because of those valuation changes. So big affordability challenges, right? In our mind, and this is walked through in the toolkit a lot, but I wanted to start by saying, in our mind, the three biggest components you need to reach affordability. One, a bill discount, right? That's going to lower the bill over time. Really, there are a couple different structures you'll hear about today. We prefer a percentage of income program where all people are receiving a bill that is based on their actual ability to pay. There's also a percentage of bill or a discount program that reduces the bill. Better if you have discounts that are tiered, because you can get to more equitable distribution of affordability across different varying income tiers. The second critical component, arrearage management. If you give a discounted bill, but the household has a pile of debt, they're never going to be able to catch up. So you have to do something with those arrears. We prefer programs that give, some level of forgiveness for every in full payment that a household makes, right? Incentivizing that household to make those full payments whenever they're able to, and to work down their debt by making those on-time payments. You see big payoffs in terms of reduced collections expenses, uncollectible accounts, and other types of associated costs that utilities bear when they go through that. And then the third component, and I think this is a really critical one that gets forgotten, is the need to do leak and line repair and conservation. Many low-income households live in older homes, leaky pipes, and don't have the resources to make those repairs. So toilets go running for longer. That results in higher bills. If you can help a household get control of that high usage, you can reach affordability. Um, so a couple of strategies we use, right? And as I was thinking through how do we go about moving affordability in Pennsylvania? Really, the first is identifying which of our coalition partners there are. And they're at the local, state, and national level. All of you, many of you on this call are probably partners of ours in some way or another, whether you even know it or not, right? We do a lot with local community-based organizations and advocacy groups who are pushing and for affordability, and we're able to provide legal representation and policy technical advice so that we can help them achieve their goals. We also work with a lot of state partners. We work directly with utilities. We work with national partners. In fact, I'll talk briefly about our work in Pittsburgh. And we brought in co-counsel from the Natural Resources Defense Council, who were experts in lead removal, because the local groups we were working with on the ground there really wanted to advance not only affordability, but also making our water clean, right? So we need those dual goals, and you cannot get there alone. So, look around you at the legal services, the social services, housing providers, and others that really care about access to water. The second being, one of the strategies we've used is to establish a working advisory group at each of the utilities. In Pennsylvania, there's about 2,000 small municipal authorities, so certainly you can't get to all of them, but we have established advisory committees at each of the investor-owned utilities that provides, a conduit for communication. It allows us to work to reach common ground and to design programs together. Um, Uh, if you are working on getting an advisory group set up and there's resistance, try utilizing it as a settlement tool, and be specific, right? Set the parameters. How often will it meet? What data needs to be shared? Who are the members going to be? Making sure that there's both local representation from different social services groups that are working directly on this, program implementers, utility management, and importantly, relevant government agencies. Having everybody at the table sometimes, you spin your wheels a bit, but it opens up, it allows those relationships to be built. The other point I'll make is having them meet regularly is important, right? You can't just have a once a year meeting and expect that advisory group to move anything. Um, the next thing, is hopefully you're moving towards a proposal in those working groups and advancing those proposals then through litigation. If that's an opportunity, that's going to be an opportunity mostly with private water and perhaps some large public water companies that have kind of an established due process system where rate cases are vetted. But when you're working with smaller, we work with a lot of very small municipal authorities, publicly owned water. That's really a different strategy of moving proposals through the local board and the government that's in that local community. And the last piece I'll say is you have to stay engaged throughout the process, from implementation through, running these programs, because they don't automatically, you can't establish a program and expect there to be enrollment overnight. It takes a lot of attention and time. These are long-term strategies, right? And they're also incremental. It's really incremental work. And if you plan out a long-term strategy and then start to work through that, we've had over the last 7 years a very long-term strategy to move through multiple proceedings, a staged approach to get these affordability programs up and running. So a little bit about the programs and the successes we have seen in Pittsburgh Water and Sewer Authority. You can see we've got those three main components that we think are most important. An affordability program that gets at a bill discount. And this is tiered, right? And you can see I'm not going to repeat what the different discount levels are. It's not a percentage of income program, but through multiple proceedings, we've been able to move from what was just a 50% flat discount on the basic service charge, about 15 bucks a month off, to having really deep discounts that get a lot closer to affordability and that are a bit tiered so that those at the very bottom of the federal poverty level are getting the most assistance with their water bill. Um, I'll say in each case that we moved a piece of these programs, we set the stage also through settlements to further advance, and make sure that there was a requirement to make another proposal, right? So that we weren't back at the drawing board in the next case saying and making the proposal on our own. We really moved that through the working groups together, working with the utility to address their concerns, working with community groups to address theirs, and finding that common ground where we're meeting the balance between the need for enough operating funds, right, and to keep the cost effective, and the need to make sure that we're not pricing low-income households out of water. Um, uh, Key to each case also is to do the affordability analysis and understand what at the end of the day, when you set this program in motion, what each household's going to pay depending on their percentage of income. And not enough time to dig into those details here, but certainly welcome outreach from any of you after this, and I can share more details about how to do that kind of analysis in utility cases, or before a board or local government, if you're working with smaller systems. A couple other important advancements we made with the Pittsburgh Water and Sewer Authority that are worth mentioning here, but aren't strictly universal service programs. We took a look at what the collections processes were, and we found that a third-party debt collector they were using was assessing a 15% compounding late fee after 90 days. That was along with pretty substantial hundreds of dollars in lien fees, and they were needlessly compounding the affordability challenges. So we were able to work with PWSA to come up with a new strategy to fire that third party that was really only contributing to adding to those costs, and see some benefits across the board in terms not only of improved access for those customers that are behind, but also improvement in collections, because it wasn't so hard to collect on the underlying debt if there wasn't piles and piles of additional costs layered in. Um, so I think I'm running pretty short on time, as always is the case in panels as exciting as this one. Just note that we made similar progress in Aqua, Pennsylvania with those 3 different components of affordability programs. These were conditions of an acquisition settlement, right? Where we were able to say, okay, if you're going to acquire this system, we want you to present a comprehensive universal service program in your next rate case. And that was one staged approach, right, where we could ease into it. And then in the next rate case, they proposed these different programs, and we were able to make adjustments from there. Last piece I'll hit on is, of course, working with local authorities that are not subject to kind of broader due process proceedings in terms of rates, which afford a huge step to get towards affordability programs. We worked heavily with Lehigh County Authority, with the local community action partnership agency there, and with other community members that had deep ties to the authority's board and other key members of the authority. And we were able to work with them to create not only a new grant assistance program, but also kind of tiered payment assistance or payment arrangements, right, which was new, and it's a step, and we plan to continue to work with them over time to further advance and hopefully come up with a rate discount program as well. So lots of challenges up next, data sharing being the biggest one, but also standardization across our state. We have patchwork of so many different programs. We're trying to bring some common threads to that. So with that, I know I'm out of time, so I'll just say, I think my information should be available. Reach out anytime, and pleasure to be here with so many of you who are doing this important work.
Thanks, Liz. I think I'm up next.
That's correct.
See if I can get my screen shared here. Here we go. Okay. Good afternoon. My name's Robert Ballinger. I'm an attorney at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia. We are a nonprofit organization that provides free civil legal assistance to low-income Philadelphians. And as part of that, one of the things we do, among many things, is we help with utility disputes and affordable utility services for low-income Philadelphians. And what I'm going to talk about is a little bit of the history of how we've gotten to where we are today. And where we are is we have a percentage of income payment program for low-income water customers. So we're going to start way back when. And this is an admittedly incomplete history of water rate making. And the reason it's important to talk about rate making become evident. But basically, under the city charter dating back to 1951, the water commissioner was in charge of setting the rates for the water department. So the head of the department would set the rates by regulation. Starting in the 70s, around the same time, the State Office of Consumer Advocate was formed. CLS, on behalf of the residents of Philadelphia, began to engage in consumer representation in rate disputes and in rate proceedings. And sort of the first place where we found real traction was in 1979's case Acorn v. Guarino, Guarino being former water commissioner Guarino. And we actually enjoined the rates from going into effect. And the judge in that case required the city to go back and conduct de novo hearings because of the size of our system and the complexity of estimating what the revenues need to be and translating those into the specific rates that customers pay, the argument was very persuasive that we needed to actually understand in order to provide any feedback to the water commissioner that would help to basically bring some fairness to the rate proceeding. After that case, we continued to engage in ongoing appeals. Typically, we would file and pursue relief by appeal from water commissioner rate determinations. And that led ultimately to the establishment of rate regulations in the 90s and the requirement to appoint a designated representative of consumers, the public advocate. That is one of the hats that I wear. I have a contract now to represent the interests of residential and small business customers because the water department is requesting a 21.4 or 21.6% rate increase over the next 2 years. So basically, the framework that was built over decades of cases was one that required the water commissioner by regulation to appoint a hearing officer and a public advocate. Well, the city actually did that. It wasn't the commissioner, but it was the commissioner's regulations. Under that approach, the regulations also provided that rates would be set by regulation. So we continued to appeal those for a number of different reasons over the years until the 2008 rate case. And for a number of reasons, we did not appeal that case, but instead we brought an action at equity in the Common Pleas Court, the trial court in Philadelphia, in its original jurisdiction, challenging the water commissioner's regulations because they deviated so significantly from the recommendations of the hearing officer. We didn't believe there was a good reason expressed for that deviation, a deviation from the record that had been established. That case went all the way up to the Commonwealth Court, which eventually affirmed our belief that to challenge a rate regulation, you have to file in the trial court's original jurisdiction. That's how you challenge a regulation. Shortly thereafter, the city amended the charter and passed a new ordinance now vesting the rate-making power in an independent agency, which is the Philadelphia Water, Sewer, and Stormwater Rate Board. So that was first established in 2013. We'll talk about some of the cases involving that, the rate cases, but one interesting note is that after the 2018 case, we appealed the rate board's determination in that case, and the trial court held that we didn't have a right of appeal, even though the ordinance says that any participant can appeal within 30 days. So we ended up having to go back to the Commonwealth Court to get some clarification that yes, in fact, participant in a water rate case in Philadelphia can appeal to the trial court's appellate jurisdiction, and that the standard that applies is the same standard of review that the court uses to determine whether or not a local agency adjudication should be upheld or reversed. So basically, have due process rights been violated, an error of law committed, an error or failure to follow a governing regulation, or whether a finding of fact is unsupported, a necessary finding of fact is unsupported by substantial evidence on the record. So what we have, and to give a little bit of the pros and cons, is we have a procedure now under the rate board where, again, we have a public advocate, we have a hearing officer. The board's regulations provide for discovery, testimony of our witnesses subject to cross-examination on the record. And all of that has to happen in a fairly compressed time frame. It resembles the procedures that are utilized for rate making for the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission, public service commissions of other states. So it is a robust and significant undertaking, and it does require that there's expenditures for the hearing officer, for the public advocate. Although the members of the water rate board themselves serve as volunteers, to do their functions, there has to be an allocation of funding. And all of that comes from the water fund. So they have to be able to have staff sufficient to help them get through the case. And so that's sort of one of the things that you're balancing is the confidence in the determination being made, having been scrutinized very carefully and challenged in some contexts or in some events, versus the expense of having that type of procedure when the water department goes and asks for an increase in rates. So in my opinion, one of the things that's a benefit of that structure is that I get to get information in every case that can help in a lot of the same ways Liz was talking about, can help sort of set the stage and continue to advance affordability for customers, particularly those customers who would otherwise likely lose service. When I started this work, we had a program that provided a $200 grant per account and levelized bills over a 12-month period for low-income participants. There was an additional amount that could be paid toward arrears, but the main problem with that program was it was constrained by the budget, and participation was constrained as a result. But when we looked in the 2012 rate proceeding at what was going on, how participants were actually being impacted by that, what we learned was that over a period of 4 years, participants in that program actually increased the amount of indebtedness that they owed. Which is a little bit of an odd thing to expect, because you give someone a lower bill. And this is true even for customers who paid all of the lower bills that they incurred. They still came out of the pipeline more in debt in a large number of circumstances. In a single year's time between 2013 and 2014, the water debt liened against just residential properties in the city of Philadelphia increased by $30 million. And 80% of the total water debt that is liened on Philadelphia households was already more than 2 years old. So we had a massive new amount of debt, but we had even more really old debt that was burdening communities in Philadelphia. And I'll show you a little bit about what that looked like in a moment. Our city council became very interested in this and basically concluded correctly that water debt was really clustered in communities of color, and a very significant portion in one particular district. We had these experiences going into hearings at city council and hearing council people who had worked in city council for years and years, and had been in constituent services and then got elected, and now sitting in the seat of a council person saying, this has been going on for decades. We always have heard from Philadelphians, low income and struggling Philadelphians, that they come into our office, they have an unaffordable water bill, and they're unable to get any relief, and they end up agreeing to payment terms they know they can't afford just to keep the water on. So this was all happening sort of very publicly in city council during the period of time that the city was also changing the construct of rate making, at least changing the ultimate decider from the water commissioner to a separate and independent rate board. So here's what I was referring to in the concentration of water debt. And I want to just pause and acknowledge for a second that these are the terms, the census maps, these are the terminology that are used by the census, not CLS terminology. So on the left, there's a map that was created by the water department showing sort of the concentration of eligible accounts that could be shut off as of April 30th, 2017. And you see that there is a significant overlap in the concentration in those households for what are referred to as Black race and ethnicity and Hispanic ethnicity. And in that one on the far right, the dark area in the census map for Hispanic race and ethnicity, that is in fact the district that was formerly occupied by Councilwoman Maria Quinones Sanchez, who was the principal sponsor of the legislation that authorized the creation of a new program. So 20% of all the water debt in the city was concentrated in that one of 10 districts. So we worked with Councilmember Sanchez, and she introduced legislation in June of 2014. It took about a year and a half to get it finally passed and out of council, and surprisingly, even signed by the outgoing mayor. And I refer to it as a framework because during the process of doing it, we really tried to legislate affordability standards. There was sort of a back and forth between sort of what council's goals were and what the authority over rates and charges would be under the new board. And where we ended up was with these sort of key touchstones. And I see I don't have much time left, so I'm going to zip through these. Bills must be affordable based on a percentage of household income, and the board's going to determine that. There must be arrearage forgiveness. You can't be required to make payments beyond the affordable bill to maintain service, and there are sheriff sale protections in place. So in the 2016 case, we put forth our vision of what that meant, and we said that would be a PIP, a straight percentage of income payment program, and the board agreed with us. At that point, after the 2016 rate case, that program launched in July of 2017. In 2018, we found out through the discovery and the process of the rate proceeding that the amount that was included in base rates to fund the program was about 75% more than the actual costs. So what happened is the concept of a rate rider, a reconcilable rate rider, was something we had put forward before, and now we found ourselves with pretty much universal agreement that we should fund this particular program through its own rate rider that would adjust up and down. We appealed that case, I mentioned that earlier, but not for anything related to TAP. So in the most recent concluded rate case, we settled a majority of the issues in that case. But importantly, the water department implemented after that case incremental forgiveness of arrearages. So for every customer in TAP who pays their TAP bill, they get forgiveness of 1/24 of the balance that they had before they got into TAP. And when that went live at a point in time, and customers got all of the prior bills counted for purposes of arrearage forgiveness, the city actually wrote off about $17 million of debt at one point in time. So before I close, I want to just point out that this rate rider is working. We reconcile it every year, and the charges associated with funding the program go up or down, depending on whether last year's collections were more or less than the total program costs, and refunding to customers in the event that they've overpaid by reducing the rider on a going forward basis. Couple of challenges that still persist. Tenants is a problem. They don't often have access to customer status. And about 11,000 houses in Philadelphia have tangled titles, meaning they're typically owned by deceased persons. So it's hard to figure out who has the authorization to become a customer. Last slide is just some additional resources. I'm going to turn it over. I know I'm at the end of my time, but all of the information about rate proceedings in Philadelphia since 2016 is publicly available and accessible. You can look up all of our testimony, all of our discovery, anything that wasn't confidential, and you can see it all there if you're interested. Thanks.
And I think that I am next. Let me share my screen. Okay. Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kyle Jones. I'm the Policy and Legal Director with Community Water Center. For those who don't know, Community Water Center, we started a little over 15 years ago with our co-founders who were door knocking in the southern San Joaquin Valley, really organizing residents around nitrate contamination in their drinking water supplies. And since then, we've focused on expanding and building the movement in California to make sure that everybody has access to safe, clean, and affordable drinking water. And the way we do that is continuing to organize on the ground with residents directly, We've opened the office that I'm based out of in Sacramento to lead on advocacy with the state legislature and administrative agencies. We've since opened a third office in the Monterey County, Santa Cruz area on the central coast of California to work on, and there we do a lot more where we're expanding our work with engineers and providing technical assistance to actually help design community-driven drinking water solutions. And then lastly, we've since hired staff in DC to expand our federal presence to make sure that we're taking this mission to the federal level as well. And the first piece of legislation that we as an organization worked on and we organized around in California was the human right to water. And that bill, AB 685 in 2012, was focused on making sure that we put a statement in statute in California that all Californians deserve access, that there's a human right to clean, safe, and affordable water for drinking and sanitation. And since then, however, we really been focusing more on clean water and safe water. We've been able to do great work on getting moving on infrastructure funding and working to prioritize funding for communities who have long been neglected. But unfortunately, work on affordability has been fairly slow in California. Our initial steps here were really just focusing on just getting an understanding of the issue. And so one of the pieces of legislation we sponsored in California in 2018 was AB 401. And the idea with this bill was just kind of to create a study and understand what would affordable water take in California. And that report came up with a number of suggestions on how to structure benefits to communities, how to scale eligibility, and came up with a cost of 141 million. And that came out again, like I said, in 2020. So before, I think, some of the supply chain inflation issues and other things. We've also spent a lot of time working on shutoff protection in California. Our first big push there was on SB 998 by the same authors, AB 401, Senator Dodd. And, we did not have consistent shutoff policies in California prior to that law. And so that law has been a huge success. It first requires that every water agency over 200 connections needs to come up with a written policy that they have on their website in languages accessible to the community they're serving to explain to residents, when, how, and why you would be shut off before that would happen. And the bill also requires that we offer payment plans so that we can help people get back on their feet before we go, utilities are able to shut them off. I think, however, after these early pieces, a lot of the the conversation around affordability has just dramatically changed due to COVID. This went from an issue that we're working on that other folks were interested in to a full-blown crisis in California and across the rest of the country. In California, debts reached over $1 billion. And recognizing that because the clean water was imperative to making sure that people could do the things like wash their hands that were needed to be done to mitigate the spread of the virus, the governor wisely instituted a blanket moratorium on shutting off utilities in the state.
Kyle, I apologize for interrupting you, but it looks like your slides aren't advancing for us. I don't know if that's just, oh, here we go.
There we go.
Now
Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
No, that's on me. Apologies. There we go. And now I can't move them the other way. Sorry. And just a quick explanation here. I do want to point this out on shutoff protections. The bill on this slide, it's hard to see because of the side of the image, but there's actually a bill for $195, and that was for a resident whose water was not actually meeting drinking water standards, so they weren't able to drink it. while we had the shutoff moratorium and $1 billion worth of debt, California went to work on helping pay down some of that debt so customers could be made whole again. And the biggest thing we did here was a $985 million program, the California Water and Wastewater Arrearages Payment Program. And the way that program worked was it the money went to the state water board, who auto-enrolled residents as soon as they were given the that local utilities auto-enrolled residents. They would give their total number of debt to the state water board, and the water board cut them a check. There was no eligibility requirements for that program. And so we were actually able to get, for drinking water, about $350 million out the door in about 6 months, which is fantastic. Unfortunately, it didn't meet the total need. Some of the debts that people had on their bills were already transferred to things like property taxes or sent to collection agencies, so we weren't able to help them with the program. And the program wasn't universal, meaning that there wasn't a requirement that water systems participate. And so we did have some particularly small water systems who just didn't choose to participate in the program and help their customers. There's also been the LIWAP program, which was a federally focused program that provided $116 million to California. And that's been struggling to get money out the door in California. Many of the small and rural water systems are struggling to enroll. Again, there's no requirement that they do so. And that the sign-up process for residents is really complicated. In some places, we're seeing the need for people to go in and fill out written forms. Additionally, there's just been weak outreach on the program. So it's not, it's been a challenge to make sure residents are even aware that it's out there to help. And so while we've done all this work to help people address the debts that they've accumulated, we haven't been able to get at the root cause of unaffordable water bills. And I really want to spend time here because I think this is I think Bernita mentioned this is it's an important concept, in that, the original crisis is that water is unaffordable. And I think most people want to pay their bills. Most people don't want their water service shut off. And I think for us who maybe don't know what life is like in that situation, imagine just being, an elderly person, a parent who's just been laid off, and think about how that must feel to have to, choose between basic necessities. Do you pay your water bill or do you pay your rent? Do you pay your water bill or do you pay for childcare? Do you pay your water bill or do you pay for your prescriptions? And all of those choices are happening for months and months and months. And potentially people are facing a shutoff. And then finally, something like LIWAP comes, or this water arrearages come, the California program comes, and your debt is erased, you can start clean. But what about next month? Then does this cycle repeat? And, because these programs are often one time, or maybe their future funding is up in the air, we don't know, we're not letting people have the security to know that their water rates are going to be affordable in the first place. And I think this is inefficient from a government standpoint. Water systems are losing money when they're having customers with large amounts of arrearages. Shutoffs, service resumptions, that all takes extra funding and staff time to do. And programs like LIWAP have costs. There's a 28% administrative cost for LIWAP, meaning, just running the program of debt relief costs, is taking 28% of the funds, and that's less resources available for communities. And so we really need to break the cycle of high water bills and bring down those bills for those who can't afford it. We should make sure people are charged what's fair, because water is a human right and it should be priced that way. So we need water supplies to be affordable in the first place. And so in California, we're pushing for a low-income water rate assistance program. And similar to, I think, what you've already heard happening in Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, in California, there's more barriers to setting these up on the local level. We do have some scattered programs, including some in, San Francisco, East Bay, Sacramento. They're few and far between. And unfortunately, a big problem is that we have a constitutional prohibition against using one ratepayer's funds to pay for another one's bill. And this actually been really relevant because that law was used to challenge Los Angeles's program and successfully got a judge to block LADWP from issuing any sort of rate assistance to low-income residents. And even if we didn't have that constitutional prohibition in place, there's just so many water systems in California. There's 2,700 community water systems, and many of them are small systems that are unsustainable or even moderate-sized systems that just serve a predominantly low-income community. And so the resources aren't there internally within those water utilities to be able to set up a program to make sure water is affordable. So our biggest push to address this came last year, I'm sorry, the past 2 years in the last legislative session with Senate Bill 222, again by Senator Dodd, who is our champion on this in California. And what the bill eventually would have done was to create a LIRA program in California that would be able to make water affordable for all. And this picture is actually from one of our rallies. There's our executive director, Susanna, at the mic. And so we took a lot of the lessons learned between the problematic rollout of LIWAP and the very quick rollout of the California state program. And I think many of these are the features we actually built into the bill are included in as suggestions in NRDC's toolkit. So really appreciative of that call out there, and happy to see that the work we're doing is hopefully making for good recommendations across the country. So the way SB 222 envisioned working is creating a program for automatic enrollment for customers enrolled in other assistance programs. So wanting to have data sharing between SNAP, between energy affordability programs and things like that, and just make sure that that data could get to water utilities and they could automatically enroll those customers. For other customers who weren't necessarily, enrolled in those programs, if they did want to apply, allowing for self-attestation to meet income eligibility limits. The program would also be designed to be universal, meaning that every water system in the state would be part of it, and every Californian who needs it would be able to get relief. And we were working to allow for third parties to handle customer data. That way it could be kept private and more secure. We also included an advisory board with citizen oversight. But unfortunately, the bill was vetoed for a lack of ongoing funding process. So where do we go from here? Well, we have a good policy in California. We know what to do. We're just having trouble finding funding for it, which is unfortunately a big problem. And our budget went from a very large surplus to a very large deficit very quickly. So we're going to work to try to identify creative ways to fund a long-term program like this. And we're also looking at how the federal government could help. Even if California could do something alone, that doesn't mean we're doing something for everyone else across the country. And so we're looking for the US, there was a pilot project for low-income rate assistance that would be housed at the United States Environmental Protection Agency. It was authorized in the bipartisan infrastructure law, but unfortunately never funded. So we're looking to push there. And then in the meantime, continuing to push for more debt relief through LIWAP, increasing the amount of funding, and trying to reform it to make sure it can be better reach out to customers. So with hope, we can make some progress this year, but please continue to look to California, and hopefully we can continue to be a leader on this issue. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning, folks on the West Coast. Give me 1 second here to get my screen share up. Okay, we working there?
Yeah, as soon as you click from beginning, it should come up. Looks good. Great.
All right, great, thank you. So I'm Larry Levine. I'm with Natural Resources Defense Council, along with Bernita, one of the co-authors on the toolkit. And I'm going to talk about not a specific program in a specific place or a specific advocacy in a specific state or city, but talk about something that's pretty new and pretty exciting, I think, actually, that can help create and lay some more groundwork for progress, be a driver for progress, I think, that's in a way that's been lacking previously. And what I'm going to talk about is a guidance document, which sounds like a boring thing. Doesn't even get the honor of being called a regulation. But it's a legal guidance document from EPA under the Clean Water Act called the Financial Capability Assessment Guidance. And I'm going to talk about how that can be used to promote affordability programs and best practices around the country at the local level. And I think I'll close at the end with some of my takeaways from it. But I think an overarching thought is that this guidance can really help shift the conversation on affordability because EPA plays such a large role in the water and wastewater sector, and sort of shaping the landscape of what water and sewer utilities do. But they don't regulate rates. They don't directly regulate affordability. And yet here's this place in this guidance, as I'll explain, where there's an intersection directly between compliance with Clean Water Act standards for wastewater, with Safe Drinking Water Act standards for water systems, an intersection between that and costs and rates and how those costs get borne and to what extent investments can be made on a certain time frame to meet human health and environmental needs, right? And the guidance tries to sort of break through where things are at loggerheads on that. So what is this seemingly obscure document? It was issued in February 2023 as an update to an EPA guidance that dates back to the mid-90s. I'm going to start actually with what it's not, because it often has been, the prior version of it often has been sort of misused and mischaracterized. What it's not, most importantly, is this is not a definition or guidelines coming from the federal government on what counts as an affordable water or sewer bill. The pre-existing guidance often gets pointed to in shorthand to say, oh, the recommendation from EPA is that 2% of household income is what's an affordable wastewater bill. That's not what this guidance is. What it is formally, it's a set of guidelines on how to account for affordability and other cost, affordability and other cost considerations when establishing compliance schedules for municipal wastewater systems to comply with the Clean Water Act. Things like sewage overflows would be a prime example of that. But as a practical matter, it represents a really important shift for EPA because it places a new emphasis on solving both clean water needs and affordability needs, rather than assuming that there's a zero-sum game. I'm going to unpack that. So the guidance, what does it do? It recognizes, first of all, that when you are trying to identify the extent of affordability challenges, and again, it doesn't provide a definition or a recommendation on what's affordable, but it does have metrics that get used in the analysis of these compliance schedule questions. And so the new guidance, unlike the old one, recognizes that looking at bills as a percentage of median household income within the service area of a utility is not by itself a good measure of affordability. And the reasons for that, I think, are probably clear to most or all of the folks on this webinar, which is that half the population, half of the households by definition make less than the median household income. And those who have the greatest challenges affording their water bill are going to be at the lower end of the income distribution. So if you're looking only at bills as a share of median household income, you're missing most of the picture of understanding affordability challenges. And so the new guidance, one major shift in it is incorporating a look at water bills as a share, wastewater bills in this case, as a share of the 20th percentile household income. There's lots of methodological issues and questions that can be raised around that, but it is a major shift to recognizing that it's important to look at low income affordability in particular. The piece of the guides that I'm going to focus on though is the other major piece of it. And that's what's new is in the context of Clean Water Act compliance schedules, it really directs utilities to consider a wide range of options to keep or make bills affordable for low-income customers and to achieve clean water as fast as possible. I'll get into this on a future slide. It's a financial, in addition to a financial capability assessment, which is the overall guidance framework, it's a financial alternatives assessment, looking at how do you achieve affordability and clean water, right? The guidance, in part by requiring that alternatives assessment, encourages the use of available federal infrastructure funds to help communities with the greatest financial need and to offset the amount of the total cost of running and improving a system that gets passed on to the customers. And it also has the effect of expediting, or its aim at least, is to expedite investments that benefit environmental justice communities, because those communities are often where there's both the most serious pollution concerns and where there are the most serious affordability concerns. And so by trying to solve for both, it avoids pitting one against the other and leaving EJ communities with either unaffordable bills or unclean, unsafe water. Okay, here's some more unpacking what it means, right? So again, and this is the point really that I just made. It's an important shift with an emphasis on solving both, not a zero-sum game. It sends a strong message that utilities, with support from the state and the federal government, from states and the federal government, need to ensure affordability for low-income households, while simultaneously protecting the environment and health. Right? And it offers a framework that could be applied beyond just this very specific context of compliance schedules. And it could be applied even beyond the Clean Water Act context. The whole idea of looking at what are the different ways to fund investments for safe water and for clean water, and looking at different ways to do it that protect affordability without sacrificing health and the environment. That concept, that framework, is not unique to the legal context of a Clean Water Act compliance schedule for sewage overflows. Right? That approach is something that can work more broadly, and it provides an entry point and a roadmap for evaluating alternatives that can improve affordability and help identify local solutions by doing an analysis at the local level. So here's how that works. And I'll just emphasize again, this is not an overview of the entire guidance and all of the elements, but really of this financial alternatives analysis piece. So it requires examining a range of options, right, for how to afford the necessary upgrades. And there's a list of options specifically that EPA expects the utility to consider, and then either to implement or to explain why they can't. Right, and so there's a lengthy appendix that goes through a whole series of approaches that need to be considered. And these range from, for example, adopting low-income affordability programs or other equitable rate designs that reduce the costs borne by low-income households. And on the one hand, that household level focus, and it also includes accessing available grant funding, making sure to maximize available grant funding and subsidized loans to reduce the cost borne by all residents. So it intersects in some ways with the new federal infrastructure funding and the bipartisan infrastructure law. Effective deployment of those funds can help to achieve the aims of this guidance as well. I'll note that the guidance, there is one legal context besides compliance schedules where it also applies, and that's in regard to water quality standards under the Clean Water Act. Whenever a state considers weakening water quality standards based on concerns about compliance costs for a wastewater utility, the same analysis needs to happen. Figure out how can you meet the standards and maintain affordability, rather than looking at affordability challenges and saying we're never going to be able to meet these standards, so let's weaken them or give a variance from them. And I'll note, just in the context of water quality standards, those always need to be reviewed and approved by EPA. So there's a very direct role for EPA anytime this guidance comes into play on the water quality standards side. So here's what's in that appendix. Some of the alternatives that need to be considered. Right, capping bills for low-income residents at a percentage of income. Right, the Philadelphia approach that Rob described. Adopting lifeline rates with a low charge for an initial amount of usage sufficient to meet each household's essential needs. That's an approach that's gaining currency in several cities in different ways. Offering bill discounts of various sorts to low-income customers, and that can take a lot of different flavors, as Liz described. Helping low-income customers repair plumbing leaks and replace old water guzzling toilets. Again, point that Liz had raised. Charging non-residential properties for their fair share of stormwater costs. This is a rate design issue, especially in the CSO context, right? Where you've got, in many places, people paying towards the cost of stormwater management based on how much drinking water they use, which doesn't make any sense and is not an equitable allocation of who's bearing the costs. By having a stormwater fee based on impervious area, for example, you're shifting costs, who's contributing the most runoff to the sewer system, and which will tend often to be away from low-income residential customers. And then there's, as I mentioned, looking at grants, loans, shifting the costs away from ratepayers. And in a similar vein, this last point here, ensuring that ratepayer revenues aren't diverted to non-utility purposes. This is a problem that comes up in many places around the country. Ideally, you've got a water or wastewater utility, if it's a municipal utility, that generates whatever revenue it generates, that goes into a pot that is used only for purposes of running that utility. In some cases, that is not what happens, and you've got people paying water or sewer rates that then get diverted to other purposes, other local government purposes, and you're essentially funding other local government services on the back of water ratepayers. That's a problem for affordability. It's a problem for having adequate revenue, stable revenue for the utility to perform its basic needs. I'm going to breeze through this slide and the next one pretty quickly because it's pretty dense with text, and I'll give you a chance to look at it later if you choose. But I highlighted here a couple of key passages from the guidance that show in EPA's words the concepts that I've been trying to get across. Right, that when you've got concerns about impacts on low-income households of rate increases, a longer schedule is not necessarily the best solution. I would say it's rarely, if ever, going to be the best solution, right? If you want to help residents, you've got to achieve addressing pollution and keeping the bills affordable. And EPA lays out, I think, nicely in a concise way some of the reasons for that. And what's really great about this policy is that it has this coming from EPA, making this sort of the view of the federal government on how affordability relates to clean water. Right? And here's just another long excerpt that talks about what the implications of that are for doing one of these financial alternatives analyses and why it's so important. So again, to reiterate, here are my takeaways. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I'm following the tell them what you told them and tell them again approach. So it's what's new here, an emphasis on solving both clean water and affordability. It's not a zero-sum game. The guidance can be a powerful tool for driving progress on affordability and on environmental justice, because it lays out this set of expectations of what utilities should be looking at and should be held accountable to examining and making wise decisions based on. The financial alternatives analysis approach, although it comes here from this Clean Water Act guidance, can be applied outside of the wastewater context, could be applied in the drinking water context. And you'll notice a lot of overlap between the kinds of alternatives in the guidance that utilities are supposed to look at and the policy solutions that are in the Water Affordability Advocacy Toolkit as well. And so I think the toolkit can serve as a helpful resource for implementing the guidance. And one last takeaway, community members, utilities, states, and EPA all have important roles in applying the guidance and this financial alternatives analysis approach in particular. It is new, right? And EPA needs to support utilities in developing financial alternatives analysis, support states in understanding how to evaluate what the utilities come up with. And EPA says in the guidance that they offer technical assistance to both states and utilities. It's going to be critical to carry through on that to make sure that there's ample support available. I say it's new because it's new in this context. None of the things that we're talking about here as solutions are brand new. EPA didn't come up with these out of whole cloth. As you've heard from other speakers, these are things that are in practice, and not enough, but are in practice around the country in different places. And so we need to draw on what's been learned from experience around the country in providing support to places that have not yet gotten far down this path, but who now need to start on it. And transparency and community engagement in all this is critical. So it's a role not just for the regulators, and dealing with the utilities sort of bilaterally, but engaging the community in all of these sorts of questions, in looking at these options and selecting the approach that's going to work, that's going to achieve equity, affordability, and clean water. And historically, that's not the way these kinds of analyses have been done. The overall financial capability assessment, which this is a subset of, right? But this overall financial capability assessment, it often gets done in the context of just a two-way negotiation between the EPA and the utility, or a state and the utility. It may not even see the light of day after the fact. It almost certainly doesn't see the light of day while it's being developed and have input into it in the way that there ought to be. So the guidance, I would say this is a weak point, and it does not address the importance of and how to achieve transparency and community engagement around evaluating these options and around making choices based on that evaluation. So that's going to be a critical thing looking ahead. I've got here collected a few additional resources, including where to find the guidance itself and some other supporting materials from EPA. There's some supporting materials from NRDC that give some overview on the one hand in a blog, and on the other hand some very detailed technical comments as part of the regulatory process when EPA put out a draft of the guidance. And lastly, I'll just say I want to highlight coming soon from NRDC, another resource that dovetails with the toolkit and with the guidance. So the guidance points out, and I think other speakers have pointed out, that water affordability programs can have a financial benefit. Kyle was just mentioning this, a financial benefit for the utility. If you've got people receiving affordable bills and paying them, that's a lot better for the utility than sending unaffordable bills that people don't pay and then trying to chase after them to get payment that you may never be able to get. And so NRDC has developed, and we'll soon, I believe next month, we'll have this out, a tool that utilities can use with locally specific data to analyze how that would work out for them, what the financial benefits and costs, but the net financial impact to the utility would be of having an affordability or assistance program on various potential program design options. And so we're really excited about having that out soon, and look forward to hearing more about that. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Larry. I think my colleague April and I are up next, and thanks everyone for hanging in. And we are just going to briefly mention 2 resources that River Network has put out that can help you with your clean water advocacy work. The first one is the Clean Water Act Owner's Manual. You may have seen this manual before. It has been a publication of River Networks for about 20 years now, and we just released this updated version. It includes new updates to the Clean Water Act that have come out over the years, but it also incorporates issues of climate change and environmental justice, and how the Clean Water Act does and does not support the implications of climate change and environmental justice, and what we can do as advocates to improve. And so the manual really provides the ins and outs of the Clean Water Act and how you can use the tools of the Act to advance the advocacy and protections for your watersheds. It includes things like problems, typical problems that folks are facing throughout the country, and strategies for action to improve those issues, things like the contamination of drinking water sources, stormwater management, loss of wetlands, raw sewage problems, and many more. And the manual also includes a really deep dive into all of the programs of the Clean Water Act, including water quality standards. Larry mentioned water quality standards in his presentation, so it's a deep dive into what they are and how you can take action. It also includes pollution permitting, citizen enforcement, and state loans for wastewater, non-point source pollution, and stormwater infrastructure, also known as the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. And each of these programs also has sections for action and action checklists, and really breaks down sort of how these programs can apply to the work that you're doing and the issues that you're facing, and specific action items to really try to find solutions to those major issues. And it also has a section on coordination with other federal laws, including the Safe Drinking Water Act and others that really make connections to how the Clean Water Act and other federal laws can really help to work together to bolster advocacy. So the link is right there, and I see Erin put the link to the manual in the chat. Thank you, Erin. And feel free to check it out. It's really meant to be a resource that you sort of come back to when you have issues, when you are interested in learning more about any of the programs of the Clean Water Act. If you have a question, or if you're hitting some roadblocks, we absolutely encourage folks to keep coming back to the manual as a resource throughout your work. And happy to answer any questions. I can drop my email in the chat as well if folks want to follow up on the manual itself. But with that, I'm going to pass it along to April.
Thanks, Colleen. And hey, everyone, I'm April Engel, and I am the Advocacy Director at River Network. And the second tool that we really quickly wanted to share with you is our Building Blocks of Trust tool. So as we've discussed today, we know that to ensure that our communities have clean, safe, affordable, and reliable drinking water, that our communities are resilient to the changing climate, and that the rivers that we all rely on are healthy, that utilities play an extremely critical role because they make so many key decisions and deliver these critical services for our communities. And similarly, we've heard from utilities who have successfully partnered with community members and community organizations that they were able to make faster and more equitable progress on delivering these vital services if and when they partnered with community members and organizations. So some examples of this that we've seen are when community-based organizations and water systems come together to do things like deliver assistance programs to utility customers, do things like distribute water filters, conduct water quality monitoring, do source water protection, install green infrastructure, or develop the workforces that are needed, that they were able to make that progress faster and more equitably. We also saw that to be successful and long-lasting, these types of partnerships between water systems and community groups depended on some core operating strategies, things like robust stakeholder engagement, community participation in the design of programs, increasing transparency, and opening up those lines of communication. So given this crucial role of successful, durable partnerships between community groups and water utilities to make equitable water infrastructure happen, River Network and Water Now Alliance teamed up to find some great examples of these partnerships and to learn from them. So in this report, Building Blocks of Trust, we share what we learned from those successful partnerships. So really quickly, the Building Blocks of Trust report, it features 8 trust building practices with building blocks and action steps for both the utility, for the community group, and then for both entities to take in order to implement those practices. And then we also feature 9 real-world case studies that demonstrate how utility and community partnerships have operationalized these practices. What you'll find in there is that the community groups we feature, there are local health and human services organizations, environmental organizations, organizations that are focused on youth empowerment and green jobs development, neighborhood organizations, and community advisory committees. And the goal is that these lessons will help catalyze even more of these vital partnerships. And so we encourage you to take a look and check it out. I know Erin's going to drop a link in the chat to the report. And I also just wanted to quickly highlight that we are also currently offering to do a limited number of in-depth workshops for utility leaders via existing training and leadership development programs on these tools. So if you know of training programs like that, also we are providing a limited number of water academies for community groups who want to build their knowledge of utility roles and responsibilities and want to empower and give their members sort of a baseline knowledge to be able to successfully and equitably partner with their local utilities, that we're offering a limited number of those as well. So if you know of utility leadership programs or your community organization would be interested in hosting a water academy for your members, please reach out to me, and Erin's going to drop my contact information in the chat. So I'd be happy to talk with you more about that. And with that, we're going to hand it back over to Bernita to do Q&A. Thanks, everybody.
All right, so we have reached the end of this webinar almost. Thanks to everyone who has stuck with us this whole time. I am going to go ahead and jump into questions that I've gotten from the audience. Tam VN asked, please, could you share some strategies that you've used to reach the lowest income families with information about these affordability programs and areas management, so that they enroll and don't lose their service in the first place, or they can actually pay off their debt easily? So that is a question I think directed to all of our speakers. So I'll just turn it over to whoever wants to jump in first.
I'll say real briefly, one of the most effective ways we've found is good old-fashioned knocking on the door. Canvassing, there is nothing better than canvassing to reach very low-income households, which we categorize as 50% of the federal poverty level or below, and utilizing mapping, like the mapping Rob put up, is really helpful. And I'll say Pittsburgh Water and Sewer Authority, together with our clients at Pittsburgh United, have kind of partnered on some of that and done a lot of that kind of outreach, really direct outreach, and then community events and partnering with food distribution assistance programs, also a really good way of getting the word out to very low income households.
I'll second everything Liz said and just add, there's so many community groups out there that already have relationships with a lot of customers, and you can partner, by partnering with community groups, and you can build on establishing existing relationships. And I think that's really valuable. or we work in the Central Valley of California. A lot of the community is undocumented farm workers. And so if you're trying to get information out to them, and if it's coming from something that, you know, has kind of a government governments look to it asking for personal information, there could be a lot of hesitancy for folks that. And so if we're able to connect with people and provide information from our own, from our kind of on our letterhead, things like that, it really helps break down those barriers and make sure assistance programs can succeed.
The only thing I think I'll add here is that I do think that it's really incumbent upon the utilities to also make sure that they are communicating to customers in need. I mean, it is part and parcel of the service provided to manage as well the billing relationship, and that's what it really boils down to for the utility. When you get someone out of the collection path, that is a positive thing. And so if someone is falling behind on their bills, the utility is also should be involved. We handle a lot of direct referrals, and we get referrals from our water utility. If they think that someone needs help getting access to a program, they'll actually send them to CLS. So you know, for better or for worse, I think we have a good working relationship with an effort to reach those most in need.
Great, and I'll move on to another question just to squeeze in a couple more. This is a question I think directed to Liz and Kyle. Olivia C. asked, for the advisory boards, was this codified in local government? And also for the board members, is there a monetary incentive for being part of the group?
I'll say it's monetary incentive. No, I wish. And it's something that I think is needed and something we recommend when working with a lot of environmental justice and other low income folks.
Yeah, and so we didn't get that far in designing our advisory group, but we do have an existing advisory group that we didn't include that in, and that's a real oversight on our part, and that's for another program designed for helping communities get safe water. I think Washington just sent out a minimum requirement, set a minimum wage for participation in hearings, and I think we recently had an in-person hearing where this really was a problem. First of all, we're asking residents who are generally low income to be able to take a day off work to travel. And so I think it's only fair to compensate them for their time that they're doing that if we want to make sure that such important voices are at the table and making decisions and leading these programs. And then secondly, just another thing out there to flag is in addition to paying people for their time, making sure that their service is not something that's a burden, that there's agency staff are able to help people get to where they need to be. We as an organization support members and had to support a member who, you know, the offer from the state was to reimburse travel costs. But if you're asking somebody to have an overnight, sometimes that can get really expensive. I think it was about, you know, with travel and overnight, it was $300. And for that's just not accessible for somebody on a reimbursement. You know, that was something that we just take the cost on because we wanted to make sure they can participate. So just, yes, there should always be more emphasis on how to make sure residents can show up to these committees.
Thanks for that. Any other thoughts from anyone else before I move on to the next question? All right. Charles J. asked, and this is for all the speakers, in your experience, which private utilities are facilitating solutions that address the root cause? How are you ensuring the realization of economies of scale? And that's for all speakers.
Well, we have a lot of private water in Pennsylvania. I'll say addressing the root cause. The root cause is the rising water costs, and we still have, you know, a 10% return on equity, and that's pretty high earning, right? So I don't see any private companies stepping forward to say, we don't need that level of earning. Nobody else is around us is earning that kind of guaranteed return to help keep costs low. We also see private water companies buying at very inflated costs other systems, and that's also the root cause, right? The root cause is the rising water costs. Now, I will say, you know, Aqua Pennsylvania and Pennsylvania American Water, the two biggest private water in Pennsylvania, are advancing water assistance programs and should be commended for that. You know, to varying degrees, we've been able to work with them to create these programs, and that's a step in the right direction. They've also, you know, mentioned LIWAP a lot. I've focused a lot more on the other programs because in Pennsylvania we're out of LIWAP funds. We've been out of funds since October. But part of why our LIWAP program was so effective was because the water companies stepped up and did direct outreach to their utilities. And I'll go right back to, we had really effective, we utilized that build a table. We brought all the stakeholders together. We brought our Department of Human Services together with the companies we worked with in kind of this other space. And we created that advisory group, and that enabled, and the utilities came and they participated and they paid attention to the program and they saw the benefit of it. So in that way, that's great, right? And they've been slowly moving the needle and you know, settling with us on incremental progress, and that's progress. So I don't want to say none of them are doing anything, because they're doing a lot. Can they do more? Yeah.
I don't want to speak to the private water utility experience directly, but I just want to sort of maybe talk just for a second, and I think it's probably for Larry too, if he's interested. But the second part of the question really goes to the efficiencies of, you know, a low-income program as well, in terms of, you know, what the I think the Roger Colton calls the net back. When you deliver an affordable bill, you take the debt out of collections, which saves on collection costs. You deliver a bill that's much more likely to be paid. The most recent numbers we have show about a 35% increase in payment frequency among low-income TAP participants compared to those low-income individuals who previously participated in TAP and for one reason or another got removed. So you experience a lot more bill payment, and then the costs of the program, the discounts, are really recovered through, you know, other ratepayers in our circumstance that TAP are. I'm guessing, Larry, that Roger's tool that he's been working on for you is going to address some of those, you know, economics. But I think when it comes to these types of programs, it is a far better way to collect for the service you're providing, because as a utility, I mean, that's really why you exist, is to provide that service. So if someone can't afford to pay for it, you still have a problem that you need to resolve there, and low-income programs can accomplish that.
And Larry, do you have any thoughts there as we wrap up?
If you have another question you want to squeeze in, if there's time, I'll defer to you on that.
Yes, we are just a tad bit over time, but I would like to get this one last question in here from Charles Seco. I think I pronounced the name right. What suggestions do you have for assisting community action agencies who have been responsible for LIWAP funds distribution? Question to all the panelists. We can close out with that one. Any takers?
I feel like a broken record a little, but I think you've got to reach out to your utilities and have them do some of the direct outreach. To Rob's point, they have a role in doing this outreach in Pennsylvania. That's why we were effective, you know, to get that money out, was because the utilities were doing an awful lot of outreach, and I'd be happy to share some of the outreach they did. They did bill flyer inserts, they did outbound calling. You know, part of it was they were hustling. They wanted to bring in the money for, you know, to help their system, and it did help. The systems that really worked, I mean, you had Reading, Pennsylvania, which is a relatively, you know, it's one of our larger urban areas, but not the largest. They brought in over $1 million of our $46 million. Why? Because they did their own outreach. So it shouldn't be on community action agencies alone. Utilities have the resources to do it, and they can see the payoff if they do. So my biggest advice. The other piece is if you have Department of Human Services or someone that is administering overall, talk to them too about making sure that they're doing statewide kind of campaigns, because that was another thing that our DHS did. They put out toolkits with, you know, social media stuff and samples that the utilities could then use in their bills without having to spend resources creating it. So having those toolkits was useful as well.
Thanks for that, Liz. Any other thoughts? All right. Any final words from our speakers before I close us on out? Well, I want to, someone said in the comments, Pennsylvania's way ahead of the game. That was Larry. Well, I want to thank everyone for sticking with us for an hour and a half to discuss affordability and assistance from the Water Advocacy Toolkit. You can find the entire toolkit by scanning this QR code or visiting the link here. These slides will be available after the webinar. Thank you so much and have a good rest of your day.